What's going on, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review episode 7 of season 4 of Better Call Saul, an episode called Something Stupid. I guess we've officially turned the page from episode 3, which was called Something Beautiful. And while the title could have very easily referred to some of the events in this episode, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the something stupid the title is referring to is probably referring to something in the immediate future that Jimmy and Kim are going to do together. But I feel like there's already so much writing on the wall that the relationship that we know and love between them has already run its course. And it's not like there's been some major dramatic breakup or major screaming match. Their separation has come inch by inch, as inevitable as the imperceptible motion of a glacier, where you can't really see anything happening in front of your face, but suddenly when it's moved on, it has moved on forever. And it's definitely going to be a very sad day on the show when they both finally acknowledge it. However, before I get to my official recap and review, a few quick notes. I got a ton of comments on last week's video about the story that Gus told to Hector Salamanca, and I misunderstood him at the time and thought he said coyote in his story, but as it turns out, he said coati, and a coati is a very different animal entirely. So much obliged to everybody out there who caught me on that particular slip-up. But in last week's episode of Better Call Saul Insider, screenwriter Jennifer Hudson made a comment that has a lot of relevance regarding tonight's episode. What was funny is that even though she wrote the episode, she was the first to say this is only one person's interpretation of the events. But she called attention to the fact that when Jimmy finally said that he was not going to be going to get therapy, and that he had to take his own path and process his grief in his own way, that in a strange way, it was almost a green light for Kim to take charge of her own life and to go in her own direction as well. That it wasn't until Jimmy made that admission about going his own way that she truly felt free to make her own career path her top priority in her own life. But toward the end of Better Call Saul Insider, they had this fantastic conversation about director John Sayles. And I love it when the writers and the editors of the show geek out about movies. For those of you who don't know, John Sayles is one of the true godfathers of independent film, and he used a hybrid approach in his career where he would script doctor and do revisions on big budget mainstream genre entertainment, and then use that money to finance his own independent films. But if you're interested in his career, his debut feature was Return of the Secaucus 7, and then later on he made some really good movies like Matewan and Eight Men Out. But one of the editors on Better Call Saul used to work for John Sayles, and he was talking about how John Sayles sets the tone on his film sets, and what an important lesson that is for basically any film or television production. But he basically said that John Sayles, in spite of being the writer and director and oftentimes the editor, that he's incredibly calm and incredibly quiet. But they said even when the work is at its most intense and stressful, that John Sayles was one of the first guys to pitch in, pick up a hammer. He's just a member of the crew like anybody else. And having now listened to 6 episodes of the podcast where Peter Gould and Vince Gilligan are interacting with their cast and crew, it's very clear that Gilligan and Gould follow that example. But with all that out of the way, let's dig into tonight's episode. So this episode started with one of the best sequences from any episode all season. And while I think we can all acknowledge that TV is primarily a writer-driven medium, that said, I absolutely love the slow, steady evolution of TV into a more cinematic medium, basically a medium that relies more on visual storytelling. And we get this great scene at the beginning with split screen. This is a technique that was used incredibly effectively by Brian De Palma back in the 70s and 80s. But we basically see Jimmy and Kim living their lives, their daily routine, whether they're brushing their teeth in the morning or having dinner together. And we see that Kim is absolutely kicking ass. And we see that Kim setting up all these trophies in her office for all the new branches of Mesa Verde that they're opening up throughout the Southwest. We see Jimmy and Huel are selling tons of phones out of the back of their truck. But over the course of this lengthy pre-credit sequence, slowly but surely, they stop eating meals together. They're going to bed at different hours. And it draws to a close in this great bit where Kim gets in bed and Jimmy's already been there for quite a while. Her side fades to black. And then Jimmy opens his eyes and you can see him sitting there just brooding in the night. And what he might be thinking about obviously is open to interpretation. But what I loved is that the sequence managed to use pictures and images and visuals to communicate information as opposed to relying entirely upon the screenplay. So while this episode was primarily focused on Jim and Kimmy, we did get some interesting stuff with Hector Salamanca and Gus. And early in the episode, we get this hysterical sequence where Hector's going through his therapy and he's having to identify pictures and he's having to identify colors. And we see something that the doctor doesn't necessarily perceive, but he knocks a cup off his tray. And as a result, a rather full-figured nurse has to bend down in front of him and put the cup back up. To the doctor and the nurse, the gesture seems totally innocent and almost like an involuntary muscle spasm. But from the expression in Hector's eyes, we can definitely tell that his interest in women is returning, and he likes them kind of on the big side. But much later in the episode, when the doctor's reporting to Gus about Hector's progress, he's watching the videotape, and Gus, being the rather perceptive individual that he is, he sees what Hector's up to, and knows that at this point, basically, the heavy lifting in Hector's recovery is now over. As far as his giant super lab is concerned, We see a lot of the work going on down in that hole. We get this long sequence to the tune of Big Rock Candy Mountain, a song that I've absolutely loved since I first heard it during the opening credits of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's a slightly different version of the song, but it's the same song nonetheless. But we see the German crew going to and from work, but we also see that the work is taking way longer than expected. They've been there 8 months now. They're not even halfway through. Men are starting to make mistakes that put people's lives in danger, but also add additional days to the time they're going to have to spend down there. Mike's talking with Werner about all the various delays, and the big question is whether or not Kai should be sent home. But while Werner freely admits there is a problem, he needs Kai. Kai actually has a useful skill set, and the big debate now is what should be done in terms of providing R&R to these guys who've basically been living in a hole for 8 months. But it almost reminds me of like some strange reality show at this point where you have these guys living together. I don't watch a lot of reality TV, but it reminds me a little bit of that show, The Ultimate Fighter, where fighters are trying to get into the UFC and they're forced all to live together in the same house. Eventually, it's like a kettle boiling over, and if they don't find a way to let off a little steam, all hell's going to break loose. But as we saw in the teaser, there's a brief shot of Kai in a strip club, so we'll see how that goes next episode. But obviously the main focus of this episode was watching Kim and Jimmy in action, and we get this great scene early on where Jimmy joins Kim at an office party. And while Jimmy's a little nervous about who he should talk to and who he should not talk to before the party starts, once he gets there, Jimmy does like the full court press with the usual Jimmy charm. He's working the room, he's telling jokes, and he basically inserts himself into a conversation where Rich is talking about doing a company retreat, something that will improve the morale of the staff. And I loved watching Rich's expression as Jimmy proceeds to be the much more entertaining, much more interesting guy in the room. He's basically selling the staff on a ski trip, first a Telluride, and then he starts talking about Aspen. You can tell most of the staff is totally down, but Rich is either visibly annoyed because Jimmy's basically stealing the spotlight, or because he knows just how much this is going to end up costing the law firm. But the main action of this episode deals with Jimmy and Huell absolutely making a killing selling all these drop phones. Jimmy's already using the Saul Goodman alias in the business cards for selling those phones. And probably the most intense dramatic scene is when an undercover cop approaches Jimmy and initially has a very polite conversation, asking Jimmy how he feels, basically enabling criminal behavior. But Jimmy's having absolutely none of it. He feels zero guilt whatsoever. He's actually running a legitimate business, and the conversation starts to get a little bit more heated, and Jimmy's kind of gesticulating wildly. And as they're having this conversation, Huell's approaching from behind. He's got his headphones in. He's listening to some sort of like honky-tonk music. It was absolutely hysterical. He thinks he sees Jimmy in trouble and ends up taking a bag of sandwiches and swatting the cop. As it turns out, the cop had previously arrested Huell a couple years back for pickpocketing. He's already got a bit of a bone to pick with Huell, and he takes him in. Huell's the first to admit that he's not going to go back inside. He'd basically rather live the rest of his life on the run with a warrant out there for his arrest than do any time whatsoever. And since Jimmy's got 1 more month until he's reinstated as a lawyer, he comes to Kim, hat in hand, asks for her help. First and foremost, she's a little bit shocked by his side business, selling drop phones. And we get this great moment where she says she's going to look into it, and as Jimmy's leaving her office, Kim asks her assistant to close the door, and almost reminded me of like a visual homage to the end of the first Godfather film, where we see Kay standing outside of Michael's office, and Clemenza and all these guys are kissing Michael's hand, and the door closes on Kay, and we fade to black. For me, this was a really strong visual cue that Kim's career as a lawyer is absolutely leaving Jimmy behind. But we see that Kim absolutely 100% proceeds in good faith. She negotiates hard on Huell's behalf. She's fighting the prosecution tooth and nail. However, sadly, the reality is, no matter what happens, Huell's probably going to have to do a little bit of jail time. And she asked Jimmy to back her play, that whatever she says to Huell, that when Huell calls Jimmy, he needs to be 100% on board with what Kim has planned. You can tell that Jimmy's not really ready and willing to make that commitment, and he basically says, you do your thing, I'll do mine. And my feeling was when he said that, all right, this is absolutely going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Jimmy and Kim are going to have to go their separate ways. But as Kim is driving away, she's seized with a moment of inspiration and goes on this crazy shopping spree, basically buying all these markers and Sharpies. And the episode ends with a really cryptic statement where she calls Jimmy and says, stop what you're doing, I have a better way. Now, there's a chance she's going to use these markers in some way, shape, or form to improve upon the con that Jimmy initially suggested to her. Jimmy had this elaborate scheme where he's going to try to discredit the officer who arrested Huell. I'm not quite sure how these markers can play a role in whatever she has planned. But here is my prediction. My prediction is that Kim is going to do something on behalf of Jimmy and Huell that basically flirts with stepping into either unethical or slightly illegal behavior. I don't think she would ever go to one of Jimmy's extremes. However, we have seen how much she enjoys some of his cons in the past. I've always loved those scenes where they basically team up in bars out of boredom to basically run a quick con on somebody. But perhaps they're going to do something together that at least will negatively impact her reputation and destroy all the progress that she's been making with Mesa Verde. Who knows, maybe I'm just a pessimist by nature. But it's starting to look as if sometime in the next 3 episodes before the end of the season, as a result of her love and affection for Jimmy, Kim might end up overextending herself on his behalf. Sadly, this season is drawing to a close. We know that AMC has definitely renewed the show for season 5, so there's still plenty more story to come. If I were to compare this episode to the rest of the season, I don't know if I would rank it necessarily at the top, but if anything, Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould have proven themselves time and time again. They probably now have one of the most consistent track records for showrunners of anybody in the television industry. The body of work that they've accumulated over the years between Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul is nothing short of extraordinary. But I imagine things are going to intensify dramatically next episode because, as we saw in the teaser, Nacho's back, which is always a good thing. But would love to hear y'all's thoughts on the episode. Definitely give me a shout in the comments below. And the best place to reach me, as always, is on my Twitter profile, @Colbrax. Coming up later this week, I'm going to be reviewing the new movie Assassination Nation, which comes out here in New York on Thursday. And on Friday, I'm going to be reviewing the new show Maniac from director Cary Fukunaga. I'm really fired up about that. If you don't recognize his name, Cary Fukunaga was the director on the entire first season of True Detective. So looking forward to cranking out those videos for y'all in the very near future. But as always, I really appreciate the support from my channel. If you would subscribe to my channel, I'll be your best friend. But even if you don't, thanks so much for watching. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.